So just a quick video about this post that I came up on my Facebook account, which I think of course, being on Facebook, I get a lot of posts of basically economic ignorance that comes from the left, I think. And I think it's important to explain some of the problems of this. So this particular post, which I have up on the screen here, it talks about basically someone who had this decent job and rent was inexpensive and various gasoline and food and all that was inexpensive. And then nowadays he has the same job and the amount he's being paid is not at the level to pay his expenses. His expenses have risen much higher than his wage. And the implication here is that actually the post itself doesn't have any implications to evil corporations and greed, but someone posted underneath of it and basically made that implication. So I wanted to clear that up. I noticed that a lot of people on the left will believe that greed and hoarding is the reason for poor prospects and poor outcomes for people today. And that they of course like to cite the income, the wealth gap and things like that, and how many people in the world have 3/4 of the wealth of the whole world and all this stuff. And I think that one important factor here is not corporations and their record profits, which they also like to cite, but rather I think that people ignore what has happened to currency, what has happened to fiat currency. And I notice that that's something that the left ignores. They have, of course, just blame greed erroneously. And they really need to study some economics. And higher prices for goods is from the following basic factors. If you just study economics, these are the factors. Higher demand for goods will rise prices. If the supply isn't keeping up with demand, or the supply is lower or gets lower, then that also raises prices. Inflation always also raises prices. And so does printing currency. And of course, that's what's called devaluation of the currency. And I think that latter factor is just less considered today, the devaluation of currency. And of course, who prints money? It's not corporations, it's your governments. And I notice the left is less critical of governments, which I think is just erroneous, because they're the ones that control the currency. So, and yet, when we have these higher regulations and higher taxes on corporations. Apparently, the United States is now one of the least economically competitive nations in the world now, but they have the biggest market, so that's why there's corporations still around. But their taxes are just so ridiculous, and they think, a lot of people on the left think that we just need to keep eating the rich, just need to keep taking their money away, and that somehow increases wealth. But it doesn't. It just takes current wealth, and largely it gets squandered anyways if the government takes it, right? So then like a third of all government money is wasted. So despite all this heavy taxes and regulation, we still have climbing costs. So maybe we need to do something else, maybe. So perhaps these current solutions need to be rethought, and especially Keynesian stimulus. This is a very old idea, almost 100 years old now. And of course, Keynesian stimulus also prints money. It's the same problem, and yet not talked about by the left. And another thing, realize that this is a covert tax. Rather than raising taxes, everyone sees higher taxes. You see higher taxes on your payroll. You see higher taxes on your you buy things, your sales tax, and people get upset about that, and rightly so. But they don't see they don't get a bill of currency devaluation. You don't see the amount of money that government is printing every year, and that is a hidden tax, because that extra money floating around in the economy devalues all the currency. And also that money that's printed, it's not like the government prints money and then just distributes it to people. It is spent by that same government. And so that spending of that new money that's backed by nothing, that just came out of thin air, it's basically monopoly money, that raises the prices of everything. You've got extra money in the system and no production to back it up, right? Normally in a barter system, you trade goods for goods, and then there's no problems. If you have goods and they have goods, you trade them. But if you introduce an intermediary, money is only an intermediary. Otherwise, it's basically worthless. Like, sure, you could burn it for heat if you really needed to. But otherwise, fiat currency is worthless. And if you introduce more of it into a system without it being backed by production or goods or services, then he devalues everything else in the system. And that's why you get these rising prices. So for a comparison, observe an unmanipulated currency, such as gold. 100 years ago, an ounce of gold could buy you a nice suit. I think it's an ounce. Let's just say it's an ounce. But anyways, the same ounce or the same amount that could buy you a suit 100 years ago could buy you a suit today. So notice how gold has kept up with its value. And remember, everyone will point to, but look, gold, the price of gold has gone up and down. It's doubled in price over the last, decade or so. But you forget that that graph is showing you the price of gold in dollars, in a paper currency. Don't look at that graph. Look at a graph of gold versus a suit, or gold versus apples, or some other good. And you'll see a far more stable amount. When you look at gold versus money, versus currency, you are seeing the manipulation of currency. You are seeing the devaluation of currency and what's been happening to it. And this is what we call fiat currency. It continues to lose value. Something like 98% of its value has been lost over the last 100 years or something like that. And I'm sure you can talk to your grandparents and they tell you that they used to buy a 5-cent bottle of Coke or whatever it used to be. And you could get a truck for a couple $100, and your first house was only a couple $1,000 or $40,000, or I don't know, whatever it was. And of course, now a lot of prices have basically multiplied by 10. And why is that? Well, it's because a currency is worth less. It's worth less today than it used to be. And so instead of this typical explanation of, the reason why things are not so great right now is because of hoarding and greed and Scrooge McDuck with his vault of gold, it's nonsense. It's a larger factor is because of legal counterfeiting, which goes unnoticed. And what's its purpose? Its purpose is to boost the legacy and ego of politicians in power. And it's we, not them, that feel the consequences a decade later, right? When politicians are in power, they will do whatever they can to form some kind of legacy, some kind of history of their great works, and of course squander the public purse and print tons of money and spend it towards their big projects. And then when they're out in 8 years or whatever it is, it doesn't matter what happens. So Bush's shitty policies, what happened after Bush was out? Nothing happened to Bush, but then we started to see some of the consequences. And we're starting to see the consequences of Obama's policies when he's out. But they're not liable. They don't go to jail, right? They just walk away. In Ontario, it's even worse. Apparently in Ontario, we have the highest debt per capita or per GDP, I don't know, one of them. We have the highest debt of any sub-national, I don't know what they call it. There's we're not a country. Ontario is always not a country. Canada is the country. But we have the highest debt of any province or state in a country. It's called sub-national something, I can't remember now. And why? Because of we have the Liberal Party of Ontario. Because of them. And they have destroyed the economy. And what's going to happen to win? Nothing. Doesn't matter. So that's why it happens. It's this greed. You talk about greed. Talk about the greed of the politicians to create these legacy projects. And our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is doing the same kind of stuff. And another thing, the image in front of you here, it's actually talking about someone putting in air conditioners. So they probably didn't work for a corporation. So but he does use paper money. Right? So he's affected. So they can't blame all this stuff on the corporations, especially when a lot of people don't work for corporations. But yet they still have the same cost and the same devaluation of their wage. Or at least the same, their wage doesn't keep up with the cost of everything else. And why is that? Because they're using paper money. So I just thought I would point that out to those who bother to look into these things. Those of you probably already know this fact. But maybe the odd person who doesn't will come across this short video.